Imagine operating a business for 6 years, believing you're protected, and discovering the first time a dispute escalates that every layer you thought insulated you was non existent. That moment feels sudden to the owner, but from an institutional perspective, the exposure was visible years earlier. Most investors believe that insulation is something you get when you form an entity. Today, I'm going to show you why insulation is not a filing event, it's not a document, and it's certainly not a feeling. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why insulation must exist before exposure, and how exposure becomes anchored early, and why adding structure later rarely resets classification, and how institutions evaluate insulation long before any pressure appears. And when I say institutions, I mean any system that has to decide whether to trust your business without knowing you personally. Banks, courts, investors, underwriters, regulators. Insulation is not about how confident you feel. It's about whether risk must pass through layers before reaching you. And many investors were never insulated, even though they believed that they were protected. Insulation means risk doesn't have a straight path to you. Think of insulation the same way you think about the walls of a house. The drywall is not what protects the house from the weather. The insulation behind it is what regulates pressure, temperature, and exposure. Many businesses install the drywall, but very few install the insulation. So if you're about to launch, insulation decisions happen before the first meaningful contract ever exists. And if you're already operating, the more uncomfortable question is whether exposure has already anchored through repeated behavior. Another way to understand this is through plumbing. Water pressure always follows the path of least resistance. If the pipes connect directly to the owner, the pressure is going to reach the owner instantly. Structural insulation works by redirecting that pressure through multiple chambers before it ever reaches the source. You, the owner. If the contract is breached, if a debt fails, if a dispute escalates, insulation requires that the exposure must travel through independent structural layers before it can ever reach the person behind the business. Formation creates distinction. That's the visual layer. Insulation, on the other hand, creates routing. That's the functional layer. If risk routes directly from the operating entity to you, then insulation doesn't exist. Now, let's slow this down. If you're about to launch, this matters more than you realize, because insulation must be installed before the first meaningful obligation is created. The first contract, the first lease, the first guarantee, the first vendor agreement. If you wait until revenue shows up to think about insulation, exposure may have already anchored. And if you've already been operating, ask yourself something uncomfortable. Did risk ever have to pass through a layer before reaching you? Or did it simply come straight to you because you were the one stabilizing everything? Insulation is not tested during comfort. It's tested when something breaks. And institutions evaluate insulation by watching behavior long before anything breaks. They look at who binds the contract, who personally guarantees the deal, who injects funds when things tighten, who resolves disputes when escalation begins. If the same individual consistently absorbs fallback responsibility, insulation is weak, regardless of what the documents say. That's not moral judgment. That's routing classification. Exposure doesn't anchor in crisis. It anchors in repetition. Let me give you a simple story. An investor forms an LLC. They operate carefully. They sign contracts under the entity name. Everything looks clean. Then a landlord asks for a personal guarantee. It feels normal, so they sign. Later, a vendor demands a personal reassurance clause. They agree. If you've been operating for a while, this is the part that usually make owners pause. Because insulation mistakes rarely show up early. They show up after years of normal activity. Nothing feels wrong while the business is growing. The exposure only becomes visible when pressure tests the routing. Cash flow tightens during a slow quarter, or personal funds are transferred to stabilize the account. Nothing dramatic happens. No lawsuit, no collapse, just repetition. And each repetition strengthens one message. When risk intensifies, it routes right here. Now, if you're about to launch, understand this. The first few decisions you make around guarantees, fallback funding, and authority routing will shape classification long before you feel any pressure. And if you're already operating, consider how many times exposure has already routed directly through you. Those patterns don't disappear simply because you later add a holding entity or begin discussing trust ownership. Institutions build profiles, not emotional profiles, behavioral profiles. They reduce uncertainty by observing repeated routing patterns. So if exposure routes directly to the person repeatedly, that routing becomes structural identity. And later layering doesn't automatically erase the earlier anchoring. That's the part nobody explains clearly. Insulation requires order. Ownership must sit above exposure. And control, well, it has to be observable. Now, continuity must exist beyond the individual. So when it's structured intentionally, the trust ownership creates continuity beyond the person. And a holding entity can actually contain the ownership interests. The operating entity handles the contracts and the daily exposure. All of the risk lives at the operating layer. Ownership and continuity sit above the operating layer. That layering changes the routing. Think about insulation the same way you think about an umbrella in the rain. If you open the umbrella before you walk outside, the rain never touches you. But if you step into the rain first and open the umbrella later, you're already wet. Many investors install insulation after exposure has already started. At that point, the structure may exist, but the exposure already reached them. The structure is personal. Now, if you're about to launch, this is the moment to decide whether ownership and exposure is going to be fused in your name or layered intentionally from the beginning. And if you've already launched, the question becomes, is ownership still fused directly to exposure through behavior? Or have you truly separated routing such that the risk can't move straight through you? Institutions ask a simple question. They're not asking whether you formed an entity. They're asking whether the business can absorb pressure without collapsing into the individual behind it, you, the business owner. Does the risk have to pass through independent layers before reaching the individual? If yes, then insulation exists. If no, then exposure is anchored. Insulation is not perfection. It's just observable separation. If you're about to launch, insulation can still be installed before exposure begins. If you've already been operating, the question shifts from installation to evaluation. Revenue feels urgent, and formation feels like progress. So insulation, it feels abstract until it gets tested. Most investors focus on building activity first. Only a few build insulation first. So if you're about to launch, insulation may already be set. It may feel like you're delaying revenue. If you're operating, restructuring may feel inconvenient. It may feel unnecessary while things are calm. But calm periods have a way of hiding structural truth. Pressure reveals the structural truth. So when insulation is installed before exposure, it changes the classification from personal to separate. When insulation is installed after exposure, it often functions as adjustment, not foundation. If exposure touched you directly before insulation existed, institutions likely anchored that pathway. Insulation has to be installed before risk ever moves because order determines the routing. Routing determines classification. And classification determines where the responsibility lives. You were never insulated, not because you were careless. The uncomfortable truth is that insulation decisions are usually made years before owners realize they were actually making them. But because no one explained that insulation must exist before the exposure begins, and institutions act on routing, not intention. Now that you understand insulation, the next question becomes even more important. What happens when institutions evaluate the structure itself, not just the exposure inside it?